up with groups like CARE, the Council of American Islamic Relations, as well as the Southern Poverty Law Center, the NAACP, and others, to educate young people about biases they may not even know they have. And while the multi-approach campaign is designed to educate people of all colors and creeds, there are growing questions about the focus of a campaign that includes a documentary program dubbed, quote, the Untitled White Project. Joining me now, Ben Shapiro, who's editor-in-chief of Truth Revolt, and Robert Zimmerman, who's a Democratic strategist. Gentlemen, thank you both so much for being here. All right, Ben, so MTV wants folks to begin to de-bias themselves, and they have even come up with a 7-day racial bias cleanse that I gather CARE has helped them put together. And the theory behind this is what?
Well, I mean, the theory behind this is that we are all racists, and even if we don't know that we're racists, we are racists, and therefore we're going to need training from the mainstream media in how to become not racist. Presumably, after that racial bias cleanse, there will be a racial bias colonoscopy, which I think would be significantly more unpleasant. But at the end of this story, of course, the solution to all of our racism is to do whatever it is that the leftist folks over at MTV want us to do in order to assuage our self-esteem, and we can all confirm that we're not racist or bigots in any way by doing exactly what all of the leftists in the media want us to do. Namely, if we want to show that we're not misogynists, vote for Hillary Clinton. If we don't want to show that we're racist, then vote for Barack Obama, etc.
Ben,
go ahead, Robert.
Ben, isn't this the point of your soliloquy where you shout out live from New York at Saturday night? Because that type of rant indicates you're auditioning for the show. There's no basis in reality in what you said at all. It's almost pathetic or comical. The reality here is that the MTV campaign, which is also done in partnership with the Anti-Defamation League, internationally respected organization, and the Gay and Lesbian Alliance Against Discrimination, amongst many others, is really designed to speak to the needs of millennials, the 14 to 24-year-olds, who have done, and this is based upon extensive research, where 41% have felt that they are, in fact, feel bigotry in their own thoughts, and 63% in that study show they've been the victim of prejudice of one sort or another. And it's not the kind of prejudice we grew up with, where we saw fire hoses turned on protesters or dogs chasing protesters. It's subtle and painful prejudice people witness on the internet or in comments that are being made. It is a very innovative program. No one's forced to participate, but it has a great educational opportunity. The thing is, though, Ben, you know, when I look at what the cleanse is going to offer to folks, it's activities like setting a counter-stereotypical image as the background on your phone. Ha-ha! That's it. That's it. Then you're no longer racist if you just put a person of another race as your background on your iPhone. And then there's consuming media that helps build empathy for people of other races. So no more All in the Family for anybody who fails their cleanse test.
That's a propaganda effort. I mean, the idea that this is not a propaganda effort and that it's not designed to change people's behavior and their thought processes is silly. And again, it is all based on the presumption that all sorts of Americans, especially young Americans, who, by the way, their own surveys show are not racist and don't have racist attitudes, it's designed to show them that they secretly are racist. And again, the only way in order for them to cleanse that racism, in order to exculpate themselves, is to do all of the things that the leftists at MTV would want them to do. There's a great awareness. Yes, it's an opt-in program, but so what?
Ben, it's about building awareness. The Anti-Defamation League is not a leftist organization, and I think it's really unfair for you to characterize them as such. They've been pioneers in fighting anti-Semitism.
The NAACP CARE? What do you make of their participation?
The point I'm making is simply that the idea of building awareness, helping young people confront bigotry so they can respond peacefully and logically when they face it, helping them become more sensitive to other people's needs, especially...
Okay, but let me ask you this, Robert. Let me ask you, because one of the questions in there, you know, you saw we're all biased, we're all by this, we're bipartisan. Do you think there's going to be a little detector to see if there's an anti-conservative bias in here for the young people and try to cleanse them of that so they can be more, quote, bipartisan?
Megan, it's not about partisanship. It's not about conservative or liberal.
They're the ones who inject partisanship into their PSA.
No. In fact, the reality is the entire program, it really rises above the partisan rhetoric we're witnessing. And I think what's really important here is that if we don't to the voices of the 14 to 24-year-olds, we don't listen to the millennials and what they're saying, then we're tragically doomed to repeat the history of bigotry and prejudice that has really impacted our society. What about that, Ben? I mean, is there any value to saying that there is some inherent bias, this sort of fear of difference, of something that seems other, and that it's valuable to sort of look at that and try to call attention to it so we can stop it?
How about combating actual acts of racism? How about singling out racism and then actually doing something about it, as opposed to doing this kind of Marxist newspeak in which we go through everybody's hidden actions? You know, I'm sensing a real sort of underlying, I don't know, racial bias to this whole segment. Robert, I find you to be racially biased. I find you to be insensitive, bigoted, and misogynist based on everything that you've said. It may be hidden. Maybe I can't detect it, but we all know it's there. So perhaps you should go through this program. At the end of the program, you will feel free, you'll feel better about yourself, and you'll feel more informed, because after all, that's the purpose.
It all comes down to your screensaver. If you need to come up with a different screensaver and again, consume media that helps build empathy.
You know something?
You guys, I gotta run.
We could all learn from this program. And Ben, you've got a future writing for Stephen Colbert.
All right.
Hey, Ben.
How's it going?
Pretty good. Is it okay if I ask like a couple, one or two questions?
If they're brief, sure. I mean, big lines.
So my biggest disagreement with you is that when you talk about institutional racism, I know you pointed out that there are individual instances of racism.
Yes.
But I definitely do believe that there is institutional racism. And the reason why I say that is because when you look at what the FBI released in 2006, where they said that white supremacists were invading the police departments, or when James Comey essentially said that there is a history of minorities being targeted by the police, and he says our history with minorities is not pretty. And then you also look at Supreme Court rulings where they say that certain governments, state governments in the United States are literally with surgical precision trying to limit the African American and minority vote. It begs the question, like, how can you say there's no institutional racism when these institutions themselves are confessing that we're doing these things? And yes, they're being checked at times, but these things are happening. So
there are a couple separate questions there, because there are specific data points that you're mentioning there. You know, the 2006 FBI report, and then you're mentioning also the Supreme Court decisions on the Voting Rights Act and the rewriting of the Voting Rights Act. So as far as the Voting Rights Act goes, there is not a lot of evidence to suggest that black votes are being undercounted in southern states. It's just the evidence is very scanty there. Justice Scalia's, I think he wrote dissent in that case. Actually, it would have been the majority opinion in that case, because they struck down the VRA, is pretty telling and has a lot of countervailing data on that, so it's worth reading. As far as the idea of institutional racism, so here's my general view about institutional racism. When I say that there are individuals inside, I'm not saying individuals don't exist inside departments. I'm sure that there are some cops who are racist. Yeah. The question is, how do we fight, how do we fight racism? When we say institutional racism, the problem is there's no way for me to fight that with you because it's too vague. Yeah. So if you say a particular institution is racist and then demonstrate to me the evidence that the institution is racist, not that it's badly policed, not that it's incompetent, because there are police departments that are incompetent, but that there's actual motivated racism there, then we can do something about it, and I'll stand right alongside you. But my problem is that when people say institutional racism, it seems to me a broad rubric under which they can subsume all complaints about American society or the cops. So you'll have situations where a black guy gets shot by the cops, and the first reaction is not, was the cop incompetent? It was, the cop had to be racist because there's a white cop and a black guy. Right? And so what you've seen is the DOJ in some cases, like for example, Seattle Police Department, they'll say that there's institutional bias there, but then they'll provide no actual evidence of institutional bias. They'll just say a disproportionate number of black people were imprisoned or arrested by the police department. Well, is it possible that a disproportionate number of black people were criminals in Seattle? Sure. I mean, that's actually what they found in 1994. They thought that there was institutional racism at the Highway Patrol in New Jersey. There's a federal case about it. And what they ended up finding, they did a study that they then tried to quash. And what the study found is that they were actually under-profiling black people, that there were just more black people speeding in New Jersey. So the point that I guess I'm making here is that I like when it's great that you're coming up and citing individual instances of data, and I want to look at each of those instances of data. I don't want to say that there's broad institutional racism in the United States, because you have to name to me the exact institution, and you have to name to me how it's spread throughout that institution, and it isn't just individuals within that institution, and then we can change it. Okay, so that's an institution that has racism. That's not the same thing as arguing there's institutional racism in the United States as a general rule, because that suggests that America is generally racist, which is something with which I disagree.
Okay. So, yeah, I might agree with you that there are certain instances of America where it's not generally racist. But then in those cases where when we do discuss that racism in that institution, it's hard as a black person, because you're then told that you cannot discuss this because you're calling out people. Like when they start talking about white supremacists in these organizations, not to say that all cops are white supremacists, but they are there. Like there are some that were invading, like you said.
Right, and if you find the cop who's a white supremacist, again, I'm willing to stand by you. The problem is when you make blanket statements like there are cops who are white supremacists. I'm willing to say there are, but the percentage matters here. I mean, are we talking about 70%, or are we talking about like one guy? Right, so and that I think is the big debate here. And so that's why whenever I have these conversations, I try to narrow it down to what's the most specific thing we can talk about that we can solve together. Because I promise you, I will go out there with you and protest against a racist shooting. Like when Walter Scott was shot in South Carolina, I'm on your side, right? I'm on the side of the person who was shot, because that was a terrible shoot. Everybody saw that was a terrible shoot. But when people say that what happened in Ferguson, Missouri with Michael Brown, when they say that it was hands up, don't shoot, that's white racism, there's no evidence of that whatsoever, and that was actually an attempt to get a cop on the basis of really bad evidence. Okay. So I think that
it's incumbent on us to actually show our work.
Okay.
Instead of just saying institutional racism, let's go out and protest, let's find the specific instance, and then we can solve it. Then we can solve the problem together.
Okay. Last question.
Yeah, sure.
So essentially, yeah, because just to add on to that, like, so I do agree, but then oftentimes when we start protesting, when we start doing all these things, there is this general fear that there is this conversation where it's already looked at as and we're delegitimized because they say, okay, African Americans are just going crazy, black people are just going crazy, and all these things, and it's hard to have dialogue. And
I mean, if that happens, that's wrong.
Yeah.
I think that it depends on the nature of the protest. So my problem with the Black Lives Matter movement, as a general matter, to take an example, is that when you say things like Black Lives Matter, the implication is not the one that, like, other lives don't matter so much as it is the suggestion that there are a bunch of people, a broad swath of people in America who don't care about black lives. That's the implication, and I don't think that's true. I don't think that's true. I think that we all care about black lives, and I think that if the question were, what should we do about this particular shooting, that's one thing. But if the idea is that cops are shooting black people because black people are black people, I don't see any statistical evidence of a trend of that. So that's the problem with BLM. BLM tries to draw a trend from an anecdote. You want to protest the anecdote, I'll protest the anecdote with you. You want to protest the trend, you first have to identify to me statistically the trend exists.
Okay. So,
Great. Well, sorry, I don't want to cut you off, but I appreciate it.
Okay. So yeah, I'll just finish off with this. So yeah, so I agree with, okay, so on the Black Lives Matter trend, yes, we do need to look at cases individually, and yes, we do need to, because sometimes there is this effect where you want to call racist immediately racism, and I agree with you, that's wrong. But I'm just saying that I feel like sometimes it becomes counterproductive when constantly when people are trying to defend these things, when people are trying to fight these things, and automatically the conversation is shaped in such a way that we're these far out-right extremists or then we're far out-left extremists trying to...
Right, and I think that the biggest problem when it comes to language, and I'll finish with this, I'm sorry, but
yeah.
I think that the biggest problem there is, as you notice, I keep trying to peg down as exactly as we can the instances that we're talking about and the language that we're referring to. And I think that movements have a hard time pegging that down. And you see that from movements all over the country. But when you make a claim as broad as American society doesn't care about the lives of black people, Black Lives Matter, a lot of people are going to get pissed at that, and I think they have a right to be pissed at that.
Okay. Thank you, Ben.
Thanks.